Welcome to the Wisconsin School Garden Network webinar, Keeping Growing When It's Snowing, STEM-Based Garden Activities for the Winter. My name is Stephanie Bugesh-Skopeline, and I am the Outreach Specialist for the network. Let's get started.
First of all, I just want to mention our funders. We are a grant-funded project through the Wisconsin Partnership Program at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. And we are a project supported by Community Groundworks and the Environmental Design Lab. What the Wisconsin School Garden Network is, we were founded in 2016, and it is our goal to improve children's health and well-being by supporting and promoting best practices in garden-based education. So basically what that means is we work to connect educators and youth garden leaders around the state to different resources and funding opportunities, and share that communications and those success stories around the state. Hands in the dirt, what does that look like? So our goal is to improve health, but what that means is that we lead different trainings and workshops. We are present at many different conferences, as well as go into the schools and the community centers to lead different workshops. We also do webinars, such as this one. We develop and distribute resources. We do have a number of briefs out there that talk about different ways to implement garden-based education. And then as well as we have physical copies of Got Dirt and Got Veggies. We also give out a monthly newsletter, which if that's something that you're interested in subscribing to, you can subscribe on our website. We also share stories. Like I mentioned, a big part of our work is to create connections around the state, and by sharing different people's stories helps to create those connections and see what everybody else is doing around Wisconsin. Another thing that we do is that technical assistance piece. So if you have a question regarding your school garden or community garden and would like some advice on how to handle certain situations, or just want to get started with some garden planning, we do offer those services as well. This is underneath the grant, so all of this are at no cost to our members. Great, I just want to highlight our website. This is the front page of our website, and I've highlighted the resources box up in that left top corner. We have a wonderful resource library. Basically, once you click on that resources, you can go to Search My Library, and it will take you to a searchable database. So if you're looking for resources on composting or getting started with your garden, or what tools you should use in the garden, you can search for that, and a number of resources will pop up. I think that we have over 300 resources there, so this is just a great way to get started and find different information if you're looking for it. I also want to highlight another tab that we have is our funding opportunities tab. We often work we populate this page, updated quite often to show the different grants that are out there for gardens around the state. And any time of the year, you can look there and see what grants are out there. They tend to be more popular around the fall months, so September through November, December, and then again in the spring when kind of planting gets started again. So March through June is when kind of those traditional grant months are. Last thing I'd love to highlight is our Wisconsin School Garden map. So this is a map that shows all of the youth garden programs across the state of Wisconsin. That is youth gardens that are at early care and education sites, schools, elementary schools, different organization sites, as well as community sites, community gardens. And we have over 600 of them are mapped in the state of Wisconsin. And so this shows just how broad the network really is. And this is a tool that you can use, if you're interested in starting a garden or would like help or want to learn about just who else is doing this work in your area. You can use this map to zoom in and see who's around you and kind of make those connections. Wonderful, and so that is, just kind of an overview of what the Wisconsin School Garden Network is. I'd love to hand it off to Sarah and Danny, who will be talking us through the meat of our webinar today around the STEM-based garden activities for the winter.
All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm Sarah. I'm the current Central Regional Coordinator for the Wisconsin School Garden Network. I was assigned with putting together this webinar today with the idea that we need to be able to keep gardening going throughout the winter, because in Wisconsin, obviously, we have a very limited season for doing some of the traditional activities that go with gardening in our classrooms. So between Danny and I, we collaborated and we came up with the ideas of talking about growing microgreens in the classroom, as well as doing vermicomposting in the classroom. But before we dive into it too much, Danny is going to speak a little bit about her organization so that you get an idea of where she's coming from, and then we will get on with the good stuff.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. So Growing Oshkosh is a 501c3 nonprofit I started 7 years ago to address several key community challenges, among them poverty, hunger, a lack, or rather a very high incidence of food deserts, and also a very high obesity rate. We quickly discovered, I was trained down at, if any of you are familiar with Growing Power down in Milwaukee, formerly the Will Allen endeavor down there. I was trained by Will and his daughter, and so we thought we were going to have a farm full of hoop houses when we quickly realized that we had more of an impact with the youth in our community. Almost 50% of our Oshkosh area school district students live at or below the poverty line, so it's very important to us to provide access to a fresh, healthy food for those kids. And so we actually have a school garden program where we build, maintain, and teach at elementary schools, every elementary school actually in Oshkosh, and we will continue heading into the middle schools and the high schools as well, but we wanted to make sure that all the elementary schools, all of those students know how to sow and grow their own food.
And I've helped Danny out with some of the planting because I
Yes.
was formerly employed by the school district, and the kids get really excited about it. It's a lot of fun. So if you're thinking about doing student gardens, get in contact with one of us, because we have a plethora of information and can help you get started. But that is for the summer and the spring. Today, let's move on, and we will talk about our two activities. I'm going to cover vermicomposting and talk about how that can work at your classroom at different age levels, and then Danny's going to take over and talk about microgreens. So next, we've got just a picture. I kind of doubled up. Okay. So if you're going to start composting in your classroom, I'm going to be very basic and very simple with this because there is so much information online, but this kind of is a good overview to get you started and get you to the right places to get things started. Step one to doing any sort of composting with worms in the classroom is getting the right worm. If you go to the bait shop, there are all kinds of varieties out there. If you go and dig in the ground, you're going to find all kinds of things. So the preferable worm is called the red wiggler, also known as Acenia fetida. Is that correct?
Sure.
We'll go with that. They're really good for composting because they're very active, but they tend to eat in one place. So instead of roaming, from in the wild from, yard to yard, they kind of create these little communities. So they're good in a small storage bin. They also have a high nitrogen diet that they quickly break down to make castings, which is really, really good for your compost. They eat half of their weight per day. So if you have these in the classrooms, you're going to see changes. The kids are going to be able to feed them and then note how much is going away at a pretty rapid level. I know I've worked a lot with elementary students, and the attention span is not always very long. So it's good to have changes that they can see within the system. The other nice thing about getting that worm is your compost is going to be produced in 4 to 6 months. So it's a pretty rapid cycle that they can use. And one of the things I want to throw in, when we talk about connecting ideas and projects to the standards, is because it takes 4 to 6 months, it's a great thing to do in the winter and then turn over into that school garden in the spring so the kids can experiment and see if there's different effects that happen in areas of the garden where they use their homemade vermicompost versus, something that they've got from the store or non-treated soil. And the other beautiful thing about these worms is that they are cheap and they reproduce pretty rapidly. You can get them at the bait shop. You put them in their bin, they get them going, and they just multiply like crazy. Honestly, I had some in my office, and we kept it for a year or two because I worked for a program at the university that did summer programming for kids. So we kind of just kept the bin in there year round. And when it was quiet, you could hear them rustling around in the bin because it was so active and there were so many. So the red wiggler, that's the way to go. Step 2, you're going to want to make sure that your red wiggler has a good home. There are several options, but the biggest thing you need to consider when finding a home for it is making sure that there's proper drainage. You don't want water piling up in the bottom of the container because obviously that's not going to be good for the worms. I know Danny here has done this through Growing Oshkosh, and she did the tote variety, where as you see on the picture on the right there, you take a couple of large Rubbermaid bins or what have you, make sure that they can stack inside of each other. You're going to put holes in one and then set it inside of the other one and let the water drip down. The stuff that comes out of there is called worm tea. Worm tea is also very beneficial for your houseplants in your garden, or if you want to do both of our projects today, it'd be fantastic for getting your microgreens going. Personally, I've done it also in a pail. Just one suggestion is because you're going to have to put liquid, if you're going to have to put drainage in it, you can get a plant saucer for like 99 cents from the Walgreens or Walmart or whatnot, and that'll save you some problems with getting stains on your floor. One other thing that I was thinking about that would be a really good idea is because you're looking at this on a classroom level, and you probably want your kids to be able to analyze their own systems in small groups. So in the summer, if you go out to the dollar store and get a bunch of sand pails, stack them inside of each other, you can have small vermicomposting units that you can use for each group of 3 or 4 kids in your classroom. And then at the end of the unit, you can dump them all back in a big teacher bin and then reuse them for next year. So I think that'd be a really good way to get some project-based learning going that the kids can actually do and be able to find their worms. One of the troubles with a big bin is the worms tend to crawl to the bottom or crawl to where directly the food is, so it's hard to find them in that big system, but like a small pail might be a good way to go. All right, once you have them a home, they need their furniture. So they're going to need a nice bed to sleep in. I put my sad little worm in the corner. He does not have a nice bed. He is not happy. So let's quick go through what should be in his bed. Or her. I mean, I guess it's a his, her. Worms are technically hermaphroditic. Yep. So yes. All right. So number 1, you're going to want a carbon source. Cardboard and shredded newspaper work great. Some things to definitely avoid would be colored paper because of the inks in there. Worms breathe through their skin. They respirate through their skin. So they're going to be ingesting those chemicals, and we really want to avoid that. Black and white newspaper is pretty safe. Standard cardboard's pretty safe. You don't want to use glossy magazines. And then even though it's readily available at schools, shredded worksheets and homework, not the best idea because the paper's been bleached. So stick with those more natural additives and your worms will be happier. Another thing that you're going to want to add in there are eggshells. Cheap, easy, save them. Crunch them up. You want to grind them into not necessarily a powder, but small pieces so that the worms can eat them. They actually go into the gut and it helps grind up their food. It's like a grit. The other advantage of using an eggshell or some eggshells in there is that it helps to neutralize the soil. So if your soil starts to get acidic, it helps keep that down. And that's another key thing for getting rid of smells, which we'll talk about a little bit in a couple of slides. If you don't have eggshells or you don't eat eggs or your kids don't eat eggs, another option is to go out and buy some lime from the store. Lime will also break it down. Or chalk, but most teachers don't have that in their classroom anymore, right? All right. Number 3, you're going to want to add some garden soil or some compost. Don't just go dig it out of the backyard. Make sure you get a nice fluffy mix that's got the right stuff in it. You want stuff like peat moss in there to help absorb water, maybe some coconut core, which is from the husks of the coconuts. Like I said, if you go online, there are so many options to mixing these things up. Just try it. Mix up some things that you think are going to work based on what you read and go for it. Worms are pretty resilient. Mm-hmm. And then very last, but probably the most important, is you're going to make sure your worms have plenty of water. And I purposely put the picture of the man completely drenched in water so that I remember to talk about how much water is necessary for your worm bin. Kids are going to want to just pour it in there, and we want to make sure that we're not overwatering it. The proper moisture content for your bedding should be about 80% water. And when it comes to thinking of that on a basic level without measuring, is it should be kind of like a wrung out sponge. So if you put your hands in the bin and it's soppy and drippy, you've got too much going on in there, and you're going to need to add some more carbon source or garden soil to get it to lighten back up. If it's dry to the touch and doesn't squeeze together, then it's not enough water. So things to consider when you're doing the experimentation with the kids. All right. Once you have them a nice home, they are going to need to eat, and they are voracious little feeders. The good thing about this is that when you start doing it with kids, they will bring in all of their lunch leftovers and more, so you never have to worry about bringing scraps from home. Also, if you do get a plethora of food, you can freeze it. So if, the teacher's lounge, there's a little corner in there that you can knock someone's lean cuisine out of there and stuff a bag in there. It's a really good place to keep it. Especially if you need something over winter break, or like when you just need to go in and feed them quick and the kids aren't around to do it for you. There are good things to feed your worms, and there are bad things to feed your worms. Number one, we're going to go over the good stuff. Worms really like vegetables. They are happy little vegetarians. They will eat meat if you put it in the bin, but it's a really bad idea. So stick with vegetables. Fruits. The only fruits you want to be careful of are acidic fruits, so kind of stay away from citrus. Brown leaves are good for them. They also like that coconut core in the corner there. They're also fond of the eggshells, which we touched upon. And then one that people don't often think about are coffee grounds. They're a little bit gritty, so they help with that grit digestion that the worms have. And they also, I totally forgot where I was going with that. My apologies.
Worms love coffee grounds, and there's no shortage of coffee grounds at most of the schools that I've been at. So
yeah.
They can also eat the paper as well, so you can throw the whole thing in there.
Yeah, you don't have to dig around with it.
They'll get super caffeinated and they'll work harder. So.
Is that what happens? The other side of that is tea bags. If you're a tea drinker or you have tea drinkers at the school, you throw the whole thing right in there too. They will gobble that up like crazy. I know one of our local coffee stores.
We had a couple of different coffee stores donate to our farm as well. Yep.
They'll save them for you if you need them. But like she said, you guys probably don't need that. All right, to the bad stuff. Stuff that you want to avoid putting in the bin are anything that's oily and fatty. You also want to stay away from citrus fruits, like I mentioned, and the worms will eat them. And if you put if a kid sneaks one in there once in a while, you'll be okay. But the problem is really that it changes the pH levels in the bin, and you're going to have to balance it out with some lime or some chalk or some eggshells. They also don't do well with sweets, so avoid, sugary contented foods. But once again, we're talking about kids. They're probably going to eat those from their lunches and save the vegetables for the bin anyway.
That's true.
Yeah.
The rule of thumb with a lot of the worms is because they breathe and respirate through their skins, like with the citrus, if you have a cut on your arm and you're rubbing that lime or lemon in it, obviously that's going to be quite painful. Same thing for the worms. So just remember that they respirate through their skins. They're very versatile. They're amazing creatures who can eat through E. coli and super fun sites and a number of different applications, but they really don't like citrus.
And the same goes for bread, not with the acidic part, but you don't want to put it in there. The worms will eat it, but it's really bad for the overall mixture and keeping it clean and smelling good.
Right.
Yeah, smelling good's important in a classroom. All right. So once you've got them fed and you've got your bedding in there and they're going to do great. They're going to reproduce. You're going to have worms everywhere. There are a couple of troubleshooting things that commonly come up. I do have a link on the bottom of this page that's going to show you a really in-depth list and how to take care of specific things, but I just wanted to list the big 3 that I've run into when I'm working with this in classrooms. Number 1, the Great Escape. Now that picture there is a little more than I've ever had coming out of my worm bins, but there were mornings when I came in and I had a worm or 2 crawling across the floor towards the door. The main reason that that's going to happen is something's imbalanced in the bin where they don't have enough water, so they're going out to seek it, or perhaps you've got an overcrowding situation where they're growing so well that they no longer have room and they're migrating to find another space to live. So just make sure that you're kind of thinking about their needs and keeping an eye on the size of the population and making sure that they're kept at the right moisture levels. The second issue that comes up are foul smells. This one you have to be super careful with because once again, those kids like to throw stuff in there. It might be helpful to put a chart up that says what you can and cannot put in the worm bins, and you can find those online too. I found several. Usually if you're getting something stinky, it's because you put in one of those bad foods that we mentioned before, like something oily or something meaty. If that does happen, take out excess food, anything that's in there that looks like it's too much, that's rotting, and let the worm bin kind of reestablish itself before you start feeding again. Another word of caution is maybe put a limit as to how much food the kids can put in there, because if they put too much food in, you're also going to get rotting even if you're putting the right stuff in. And then the last one that we've had issues with are unwanted guests. I've got a picture there of some fruit flies, and fruit flies are the most common pest I've come across with these. Yep. And the biggest reason that they happen is if the food is left up on the surface of the bin where they can lay their eggs and they can hatch. Mm-hmm. So when you have your bin, make sure you're burying your food a couple inches underneath the surface, because that is really going to help keep those pests away. Now, even though there are some pests that are unwanted, there are a lot of different organisms that are living in the bin that are really great for study. If you have small microscopes or even hand lenses available, the kids can dig through it and see what else is growing in there to make up that whole community, and it can be a pretty fun activity. Okay, then the last thing that I want to talk about before we go over to the microgreens is how we can connect the worms to the standards. I know NGSS has been adopted by the entire state in Wisconsin, so it's important for you guys to be able to use this as a tool in your classroom. On this slide, I just have one example of a connection you can make at every grade level, K through 8, and they're all very easy to do and easy to work with. One of the big things with NGSS right now is that E part of the STEM, where you're talking about engineering and design. And because these worms are so versatile and the kids can study so many facets, it's really easy to set up a model that they can use to analyze. So some things that they can look at depending on how old they are is you can look at the change in worms mass. You could have them take out a pile of the compost, weigh it, and then let it dry out and then weigh it again to see what kind of moisture content they have in there. You could have them count the worms, which doesn't sound that exciting, but once they dump it out and like actually get to see them, the kids love it. And if you get yourself some of those little plastic lunch trays, it's really good for dumping them out on and cleaning it up. One word of caution though, when you are taking out your worms and you're going to look at them, they don't like bright light. They will crawl away from it. So it's suggested to put your little compost pile, dump it out on your little tray, and then turn the lights off in the classroom. And if the kids shine a flashlight on the pile, the worms will migrate out of the pile, and making it really easy for the kids to see them and count them. And they're just fascinated by that photo relationship that the worms have, even though they don't have eyes, which just brings up another topic, because then you can talk about, how do worms know that the light is there, even though they don't have, eyeballs like we do. So there's lots of fun things to talk about there.
And how do worms survive when you cut them in half and they become 2 worms? That's another research project for the
Yeah.
students.
That one might feel a little morbid.
Maybe.
Maybe you could have them research it and talk about the validity of that, because in case you guys don't know, worms have 5 hearts, but that doesn't mean you can just
break them apart. Yeah.
break them apart and have them make more. The actual worm reproduction is pretty fascinating because worms are hermaphrodites, which, you know, they're male and female. So it doesn't really matter how many worms you have of what type in the bin, they're all the same. And they
procreate rapidly.
Yeah. And the way, I just have to go off on a tangent, because the way it works is they make this film on that saddle part, you know, the smooth part of the worm. And they interchange, you know, reproductive
organs.
Yeah. No. They exchange sperm, and then it goes in that gooey coating. And then what happens is it kind of hardens, and the worm like backs up and wiggles out of it, and that goo rolls over the top of its head, and it makes this tiny little lemon drop shape. So the kids can dig through the soil, and if they find these little baby lemons, those are actually worm eggs. And there are videos online, you can find 2 of those little worms hatching, and it's just fascinating. So they can go through there, they can count the juveniles, they can count the adults, and they can count the babies, and kind of look at their survival and the growth rates that are happening in the bin. So I think the biggest message for using anything with any of these standards is that it's a great opportunity to use the worm bin as the model of an ecosystem, because as an ecosystem, they can hit a lot of these things, like comparing the diversity of life in different habitats. All they have to do is look at that habitat versus our habitat, and they can make those connections. It's kind of endless. And if you want like a specific list of ideas, you feel free to email me, and I will send you all kinds of stuff. All right. And then the next page I have is just a picture kind of showing the relationships that you might not think about when you think about composting and worms, because, you know, you think, oh, it's a bin with worms in it, but there's so much other life going on there. And there are so many other connections that the kids can find and make as they go through and do a unit with these guys in the classroom. Okay, Danny, you want to take it away?
Sure. So, microgreens. Growing Oshkosh specializes in microgreens quite a bit for a couple of different reasons. One is that you can grow them year-round, indoors and outdoors. And secondly, they are extremely nutrient dense, very, very healthy, very nutritious. You only need a few little microgreens to make a salad or a burger or a wrap or something like that taste phenomenally better, and it adds a little bit of health to it as well. So people always ask me, what are microgreens? Basically, a microgreen is any kind of vegetable plant that you grow, but you only grow it to the micro stage, right? So we grow, in addition to a lot of the microgreens that we grow, we also grow shoots too. So the shoot part that comes off of the plant, I believe there's a slide later about the radish shoots, but when you have a plant that's only about 1.5 inches tall, all of the nutrients and all of the micronutrients are sent up through that shoot. And so as opposed to growing a full sugar snap pea or a full beet or radish, you're going to get almost, it depends on the variety, but you'll probably get up to 40 times the nutrients in just that small little shoot or microgreen than you would in the full-fledged plant. Also, as you can probably figure out, if you grow the plant to full maturity, it's going to take a lot of time, energy, resources, sunlight, water. It's going to need some airflow. And in most cases, most of the microgreens that we grow, at least, from seed to harvest are about 21 days. The longest amount would be from seed to harvest 30 days, and that would include some lettuce mixes. You can also continually cut microgreens. So you want to carefully cut the bigger ones and let the smaller ones come through. I have had many different growing seasons where I've sowed microgreens in April and I'm still harvesting them in early November. No more seeds, a few little inputs like some worm castings, but microgreens are very, very nutritious. They don't require a whole lot of light. and they're fast growing, so the students can actually watch them grow in their classrooms.
So if you want to start setting up for your microgreens, there's a couple things to go through.
Of course, the biggest thing about growing anything in a classroom is there are different variables. Heat, sunlight, and air are among them. You're going to need to germinate a lot of these seeds with an extra heat source. Do not put them on your radiators. Don't put them on an actual electrical heating source in your classroom, but you want to get either some fluorescent lights or a seedling mat to start that germination. Some, like as shown here, basil really loves a lot of heat, and actually mini basil and basil shoots are becoming popular for local restaurants. So you really want to have those at least at 52, but probably more like 55 degrees. So if you have the opportunity to set the temperature, things like basil will require a 55-degree germination temperature. The other thing too.
But if they don't have that fine-tuned control, if you're doing it in a
oh sure, yeah,
you should be okay.
Yep. If you have a southern-facing window, great, put it in there. I know I've worked with a number of schools here in Oshkosh that are in windowless classrooms or in the basement. Just simply add a fluorescent to the area, and then make sure too, when you add lights, you're adding heat, so that dries up the growing mix. So you want to make sure that it's well watered as well.
Okay.
So, you're probably asking yourself, okay, well, who takes care of this stuff on the weekends? Sometimes you have to get to know your weekend staff, or you have to find a very dedicated teacher or administrator who will come in and help kind of control these things over the weekend. The biggest thing is probably the light sources, and don't let these price tags freak you out. Obviously, southern facing windows for the most part are free. You've got some low end traditional kind of light bulbs. You can go with a normal fluorescent light. You can go depending on what you're growing as well. You could go to an LED or a traditional grow light. The far left graphic where it says $800, please never, ever, ever go online and buy one of these systems, because you could do it so much cheaper in your classroom. These shelves, which are featured here, are not adjustable, which you do want some adjustability when you start to grow other plants in your classroom as well. When they reach a certain maturity, you don't want them touching the lights, so you want to be able to adjust the height. What I have found is I can usually find Target, Menards, even some online stores, these shelves with the wheels and casters will be about $60 to $75. And then you can simply buy single grow lights. When you buy them in a package like this, ultimately you're sometimes paying for a lot of the shipping and the brand names of these particular of the lights and the shelves. Like I said, I mean, I know most school districts are strapped, so don't pay $800 for that. Go spend about $120 at, I'd probably go to Menards or a Fleet Farm, something like that. And it's going to work a lot better. And especially if you have the wheels on them, you can wheel them around to different parts of your classroom. Or different parts of your school. If you happen to have, like a cafeteria that has a lot of southern sun or something, we have a lot of schools that do that as well. So when their seedlings get to a certain point, they'll just wheel them into the cafeteria and let the natural light take over.
And if you have absolutely no budget and no windows, which is the case sometimes, you can also contact like your local police department.
Yes.
As oddball as it sounds, they seize equipment.
Yep.
And occasionally you can get some free stuff that works really well for growing.
Yep. Actually, your local police department and or if your high schools have really good agriculture or horticultural programs, a lot of times they use kind of the best of the best, and their hand-me-downs are very useful for elementary schools.
All right.
Airflow. Airflow is crucial. So when I'm teaching the kids about the necessities of how to grow something, everyone always knows water, nutrients, sunshine, and space, right? So they need space, but what they never really understand is how airflow plays an important role. And airflow plays a role because what makes a plant grow, obviously, is vibrations, which is why some some gardeners are often kind of a little bit eccentric when they play music for their plants or they sing to them. That actually stimulates their growth. And
you put them in the music class.
Yeah, exactly. And in a stagnant environment, airflow wise, like a classroom with no open windows, you're going to want to provide a fan or something so that there's a little bit of vibration so those shoots continue to grow. It also helps with any mold issues that might come around. It might also help with some of these micros have a little bit of a fragrant odor to them that isn't normally, not a typical odor in your classroom. So you just want to have a little bit of air on them, but make sure too that when you're doing that you're not drying out the soil at the same time.
All right, so once you've kind of looked at your classroom space and determined what you can use, next step there is to?
Then you find your seeds. And if you're doing this on a very small scale, it can be fairly inexpensive. If you're doing this on a large scale, such as what we do at Growing Oshkosh, we buy 50-pound bags of seeds at a time. I highly discourage doing that amount of seeds. And there's a wonderful website that Sarah has, which is coming up, that will give you the exact measurements of the seeds you need. I've never used anything more exact than a paper cup that you can find, like a Dixie cup or a Solo cup. We grow a lot of arugula. Beet greens are very, very healthy. Beets are the new kale. Swiss chard is very beautiful and very nutritious. I mentioned radish before. Spinach is another good one, but of course, be very careful with spinach because there have been recalls and that kind of stuff. Herbs are another great thing to do microgreens with. We do cilantro and basil, like shoots and microgreens, very nutritious, and you don't have to grow them to the full length of the plant. But there's plenty of different seed sourcing places out there. Johnny's Seeds on the East Coast is probably the best, but it's very expensive. What we have found for our urban farm, that the most affordable and best seed distributor for us is Jordan Seeds, and they are located just outside of Minneapolis. If you, and also with selecting your seeds, you might, oh, that's so beautiful. You might want to select some of the seeds that kids will like instantly. We've found that sugar snap peas, they absolutely love, like I mentioned, the herbs. Some of the things that you might not want to try on the kids right away, unless you want the yuck factor, are arugula and mustard greens. As you might figure out, they're a little spicy. Yeah. And actually, arugula does have a tendency to, in some people, have a little bit of an allergic reaction. It has it's a very nutritious microgreen, but it also has a very tangy taste. So if you want your kids to enjoy these and keep growing them, I suggest something a little more sweet, like sugar snap peas.
I picked these pictures because they were pretty, but
they're really, yeah.
If you're going with peas and radish, those are things the kids are going to know and associate. Mm-hmm. In their mind with too. So.
Yep. Okay. Containers. So we use at the farm and in our schools, we use these on the far left, the $5 each. These are called 10-20 trays because they're 10 inches by 20 inches. You're going to want to get the ones that have holes, and they're not really holes, they're slats, so they have drainage. Again, these are listed at $5 each, but that last slide, Jordan Seeds, I also get my trays from them as well. And I believe the latest I paid for them was $75 for 100 of them. So you can get them very cheaply through Jordan Seeds. You can also use free stuff like egg cartons, any old plastic salad containers or sub containers.
I mean, pretty much as long as you can get like an inch or two of soil in depth and you can find a way to drain it.
Yep. You're good to go. We've used milk jugs, milk cartons, cottage cheese containers, anything really. they still give milk out in school, right?
Yeah, the little
So,
boxes of milk.
sure. So the little boxes of milk, if everyone wanted to do their own little experiment with their own little box of milk and see who can grow the fastest microgreen or the most, tasty microgreen, I think that's a really good opportunity to showcase what microgreens can do too. So just look in your your recyclables or your garbage at school.
Kids are more than happy to bring in garbage. All right. And then once you have that part taken care of, the next part is to grow the kids' brains a little bit.
Yes. Yep. So you want to watch. It's amazing how students really will try foods that they normally wouldn't even get near in the grocery store by growing it themselves. This purple radish is a good example, and again, that's going to be fairly spicy, but they're very fast growing, and if you're diligent about the harvesting of them and get the large leaves off, the smaller undergrowth will come up immediately. And I've actually, with our shoot growing and our microgreens, I've literally watched them grow if you turn the fan up a little bit. So with some of these, like I said, sometimes it's 0 to 7 to 10 days with some shoot varieties, 0 to 21 days for most microgreens, and 0 to 30 on almost everything and those would also include some lettuce varieties. But as you can tell, this is a pretty amazing showcase of how plants grow. And I've found out this year too that when we were kids, we used to grow sprouts in a bag with a wet paper towel around them. And this year in the Oshkosh School District, a lot of the teachers and students were using empty plastic CD cases so that you could see the growth in all the different directions. And it was a lot easier to stack and sort of showcase than a plastic bag, and reusable too.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And if you're familiar with gravitropism, that's when the roots and the shoots will grow. The roots always grow down and the shoots always grow up. So one of the nice things about the CD case project that she mentioned is you can also turn it and leave it for a few days and watch how those alter and change. It's pretty fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right.
This is the website, which I just found out about very recently. This will give you the exact measurements depending on the amount of growing medium and the size of your container. Like I said, you can also just go by trial and error and see, does an inch of seed in a Dixie cup, does that work? Does a half of a solo cup of sugar snap pea, will that work? You can experiment with all different kinds, and that might be a great lesson too. Density for some of these microgreens, if it gets too dense, particularly if you're going to grow arugula, they do not like to be close together. Some varieties actually love the support that the next door neighbor microgreen provides, but arugula and a few other varieties really like to have a little bit of space to grow. So you want to be careful of that, but it's a great website.
Okay, and then once you've got things growing?
Once you've got things growing, I would, especially with students, I would advise that you get some food safe gloves for harvesting. In the A slide, you can see that they're getting very close to the harvesting stage. On the B slide, what you actually do is you want to grab a handful. If you're right hand dominant, you want to grab a handful with your left hand and get down as close to the growing medium as you can. You can use cheap scissors. Some people they like knives better. I prefer scissors.
Let's stick with scissors.
Yeah, let's stick with scissors, and round ones are fine too. And then what you want to do after you harvest them, what we do is that we refrigerate them for a day in a plastic container in a refrigerator. It just helps with they don't like to be shocked so much, but if you don't have that availability, if you're going directly from harvest to washing, go ahead and just put it in not a super cold, but a cold water rinse. Sometimes it'll usually only take about 10 minutes. You'll take them out, you'll put them in a colander or some other straining device. Again, put some cold water over the top and then let them dry on a flat surface. You'll know when they're ready to eat. They won't be wet and they won't be wilted. They'll be perfect. And then the D slide is what you actually get. And just as an aside, when I was training on how to grow microgreens down at Milwaukee's Growing Power, we had microgreens for breakfast every day, and we had these incredible meals. And I have never eaten more food in my entire life than when we had those training days, but I lost more weight on those days simply by eating these microgreens in the morning. It's like the superfood breakfast of all time. So if you can get your students to kind of munch on these throughout the day, I think they'll be more ready to learn than you anticipate.
All right, and then last but not least, once you've got things going, Danny, there's sometimes problems that arise.
Yeah, sometimes you're going to get some yellow leaves. If you have yellow leaves, then you know you need more nutrients. The only nutrients that I ever add to any of our products are worm castings, which 6,000 Oshkosh area school district students will tell you that it is worm poo. They absolutely love it. So it is the waste of the worms, which if you're doing wormicomposting and you get down to a very fine sediment, if you sift that even finer, what you will get is their worm castings, and that is exclusively what we use for a fertilizer. Brown leaves, you need to water that more often. And like I said, you might want to get chatty with your weekend staff or someone who's really dedicated who can come in and help water over the weekend. We found that just telling students to extra water on Friday and Monday doesn't necessarily work when you're first starting to germinate all of the seeds. And then the worst possible thing that you could get is aphids. Aphids are a soil-borne pest. They're the worst. They're not poisoning your plants or anything, and they're certainly not poisonous to eat, but you don't want to have that crunch when you're biting into your microgreens. They lay their eggs, nest and lay their eggs underneath the leaves of leafy greens. And so if you're starting to notice something like these bugs, you're going to want to get rid of that instantly. You'll want to get rid of the plants instantly and the soil as well. You don't want that kind of proliferating in your classrooms.
And if you end up with one tray that's got it and it's not too close to the other trays and they haven't been infected yet,
then if you are fairly sure that you've caught it in time, then we can go to the next slide. And like I said, we use nothing but natural materials. So we use an organic garlic spray. Now, of course, you might want to wash off your micros a little bit more carefully after you spray garlic on them. But I love garlic. Garlic is great for fighting disease and infection. So it's great for fighting the aphids as well. So there's a recipe here you can use for microgreens. They also, if you're going to grow other things in your classroom, particularly tomato and peppers, sweet peppers, they love sweet pepper leaves. So you would just want to be diligent about looking underneath the leaves. And if you find a problem, try the garlic spray. If it doesn't work, get rid of them. And unfortunately, you do not want to put these in your compost. You want to put them in like a black plastic bag and throw them in your regular trash.
Danny, if you accidentally eat some of the aphids, are they toxic?
No, they're definitely not toxic. I have been to farm to table events before where I have had lettuce with aphids in it. It is not delicious, but it is also not toxic. And as I had mentioned before, shoots and microgreens have up to 40 times as much nutritional density as the full-grown radish. And I think too that with a lot of students, especially younger kids, when you can get them to try something as cool and something that they grew themselves, like a radish shoot, they're going to enjoy that a lot more than taking a chomp out of these radishes. At least I would.
Oh, I love radish.
Okay. So here.
I think we went a little too far there. Okay, thanks, Steph. Once again, I kind of listed out some standards that are very applicable to the microgreen growing process. This is another project where if you use it as some sort of engineering, where you have the kids, construct their own container and what they think is going to grow best, it's fantastic for that. You can, if you're at the second grade level, planning investigations, to see if plants need water and sun and other nutrients to grow. I mean, it's really simple to, put one in the dark and put one in the window, or, don't give one water, and then they can analyze that. I mean, anytime you have something growing, you've got an
It's STEM.
entire system. It's STEM.
Mhm.
I mean, you can look at it and you can find a way to make it work. And especially with the way the NGSS standards are right now, I mean, you are the facilitator in the classroom when it comes to something like this. Have the kids come up with ideas. Have the kids think about what they want to learn about it. Have them think about all the variables that can be changed, and then let them run with it. Because if you let go of that control in the classroom just a little bit, you'll be amazed at the things that these kids come up with.
Yeah. Sometimes I get stumped on some of their questions actually too. One very astute student asked me this last year. Well, I don't understand why different seed varieties are different sized. Why is that? And I said, that's a really good subject for you to research. So they can come up with questions like that on their own. That is very inspiring, I think.
Yeah, and especially when you have living things in a classroom. I know there's a lot of restrictions now in regards to vertebrates and other organisms. Teachers' pets aren't really a thing anymore. So pulling in something that they can interact with is really, between microgreens and worms, is really good for them. And I think these two projects together dovetail fantastically, because even if you don't have access to a garden outside, you can use the compost from the worms to feed the microgreens. And if you have too many extra microgreens, you can feed them to the worms, and it's a fantastic cycle that goes over and over in a neat, tidy little package.
Yes, exactly.
Right, and then I think the last slide that we have, I just put a couple of resources that are different from the ones that were already shared by Stephanie. Thank you for doing that as we go here along, Stephanie. I think one of the nicest ones when you're writing lessons plans is that connections to the NGSS standards on the top, because the Life Lab group has gone through and pulled out pretty much every standard that matches any sort of gardening in the classroom, which makes that whole process a lot easier for you rather than wading through the whole book.
Yes.
Great. Well, I just wanted to thank Sarah and Danny for their time today. I will be putting the rest of those resources in the chat here momentarily, as well as sending out all of these links that I've been putting in the chat to everybody, along with a link to the recording of this webinar. I do want to take just a couple of moments for questions. I know we are almost at the hour mark, but we do have a couple of questions regarding the worms. We have a question about how much do you feed them, or how often do you think that they need to be fed?
It's a good question. It depends on how many worms you have.
It does. It depends on the size of your colony. But, just for starters, if you have a bin that's the size of like the big Rubbermaid tote, when we, put in, like 50 worms, if you put in like maybe a quarter cup a day, they're gonna subsist on that. But as your colony grows larger, you'll be able to see the food disappearing. I mean, because you can kind of dig through the surface and see, oh, there's nothing left there. So just up it as your colony grows. I don't think we've ever had to do more than like a cup of food a day.
You'll be able to tell. I mean, if they're burning through it and you don't see any of the food products anymore, just keep adding them. Another thing I forgot to mention too is that they absolutely love bananas and banana peels. That's where you'll often find where they're going to nest, and you'll find these crazy busy colonies of little white baby worms inside the banana peels. So that's a great input.
Okay. Steph, are there other questions?
Wonderful. Yes, another question. I'm just going to back up one more slide. Somebody asked me to back up one more slide, so I'll back up there. They also had a question about compost tea, is in terms of dilution, if you wanted to use this tea for your fertilizer for houseplants, or maybe other plants that you have in the garden, or maybe your microgreens, would you dilute that in some way, or how would you suggest using that?
Probably yes, just because it's going to be extremely nutrient dense if you just take the raw product. And the reason they kind of call it tea is because that you can add more of the water, you can heat it, you can kind of experiment with the different additives that are in. To stretch it out, I would absolutely dilute it. You'll still get a really good effect, a really good fertilizer if you take it, even if you probably double or triple the amount of liquid that's in it.
You could probably go about 50-50 or a little more.
Yeah, yep. Any
Great,
amount
thanks.
is great.
Yeah, sounds great. So just forward back here again, I'll be sending out, this webinar has been recorded, so I will be sending out a link to everybody that has joined in here or signed up. So you can watch it again if you joined us late. And then I'll make sure to send out all the links to all of these resources. But here are our emails. So if you'd like to contact us afterwards, again, if you have further questions or just kind of want to start a discussion about vermicomposting or microgreens or other activities that Sarah and Danny have done, we'd be happy to answer those. So thank you all for your time, and this will conclude this webinar.